angibingelele the audience at large. Ndibulele elithuba lokuthi ndifumane inyweba yokuthi ndibe lapha. I will interpret towards the end of what I'm about to do, so that we don't feel left out. All of us are in the same room, but please allow me to first address myself in the best way I know how to. That is in isintu. Ndibulele elithuba ndilinikwayo nenyweba engaka yokuba ndize kuthetha apha ngumcimbi obaluleke kakhulu njengoba seletshilo umhlali ngaphambili. Ndingumdidiyeli weinkqubo zokugcinwa kwamafa esizwe. So in my capacity as a curator, I am tasked with a very sensitive issue of caring for things that matter in society. Now, it's a very kind of a thorny kind of subject to talk about an archive in this context. Now, when the program director approached me to ask me to do this talk, initially I did not want to accept the invitation. Bengafuna ukuza la. Because at times singabo mama sinengxaki zamakhaya. We have to look after the kids. Traveling sometimes it messes with your schedule. So I initially didn't want to take this, but when Ubudumwelela told me that the theme for this talk is going to be on the archive as a place of erasure, it then took me to a conversation we had last year, that I was complicit in a discussion that dealt with issues of archive. And in that conversation, it was myself, Atambile, and Zubeida Jeffa. We were deliberating on the archive of the Historical Kaka Charlotte Maxeke. And from that deliberation, we were all in agreement that archives are a place of erasure. As much as we like to think of them as a productive space where preservation of records takes place, but it is at the same time a place of erasure. And we were able to justify that a statement based on the hard work of doing research on a life of a person. Now, just to recap that discussion, uma sisenza i-archival research on Uma Charlotte Maxeke, initially, the understanding was that because there was so much written and so much spoken about her, now the assumption would be that there would be material on her. Guess what? In our first interaction with her, only to find out there's very little material on her. Maxeke's archival traces in South Africa were very, very thin. That we were able to ascertain that really archives maybe are not archives zabantu, anditi. So it becomes a place of erasure, that when you go to an archive to look for records to do with, for example, for a person like Uma Charlotte Maxeke, we're looking for a record of her birth, like your birth certificate as a form of validation. Because in academic setting, for us to be able to validate, you need documentary evidence. Now, without that, you cannot claim that so-and-so lived at a certain period. Now, we went back to find out that even the very practice of documenting a life, that is registries, in South Africa, masibheka emuva, what had happened was that phansi kwenqubo yobukoloniyali, the practice of documenting lives only became effective in 1895. It was promulgated in 1894 and made official in 1895, which means all those who lived prior to that year, they wouldn't have records in the state repositories. So by design, we can establish that the archive becomes a place of erasure, for you are unable to account for the existence of those who lived prior to that moment when the state decides to record people's beds, you know. So it becomes a place of erasure by design. Angithi? So whenever we approach the archive, there's this other aspect of the archive, ukuthi. When you go to the archive, there's this validation that the archive is going to tell you the truth claims. Isn't that so? Now, what kind of truth do we get from our archive? Right? What kind of truth is there? Now, in literature on archives, I rely largely on the work of a scholar, Ashili Mbembe, who argues ukuthi the archive is a symbol of a constituted state. So what you get in an archive, the narrative of the state account of itself. Angithi? Uma sithetha nge-archive siya, so fumana lapha there are documents about state administration, right? How a state administers its citizens. Isn't that so? Now, when we look through that lens, archive through the state, you are most likely to get a statist discourse. That is conversations by the state, right? State taking charge of the narrative of itself. Now, when we go to that with a question that seeks to establish the presence of abantu, you're most likely to get the state's account of how it administers abantu. Now, people's experience of that administration is not in that archive. Isn't that so? So when we talk about the archive as a place of erasure, we define the archive as that which is a symbol of the state, but at the same time, that which gives us a narrative, a story of how the state evolves. So it's a statist discourse. Now, when we limit ourselves to that space of an official archive in that sense, we're less likely to see the potential of other forms of engagement, right? So uma ngaba sizohlala sisoloku silila sithi i-archive is a place of erasure. Now the next question would be, what other forms of memory that fall outside of that realm of archiving that is state-generated? Now, it was in that context that I was able to uncover Histories that I would not have been able to write a thesis on Charlotte Maxeke if I had worked with a conventional understanding of the archive, which is going through the state archive in Pretoria, going through the state archives in Cape Town. Both were spaces of erasure for me. For none of those collections had assisted in my quest. Now, going beyond that erasure, what do we get? Right? How do we move beyond a place of erasure? And I think I don't have all the answers. For me, it is still holding on with the notion of things the way they are, that e-archive is a place of erasure. But what other forms of kind of agitation that begin to form around that character of the archive? Kuti umangaba archive wethu, as much as we want to think of them as spaces where we can validate existence, as spaces where we can get truth about the past. But what happens when you get to that archive and there's nothing about what you're looking for? Angithi? Now, this brings me to the theme for today, right? That our first encounter, we're encountering an erasure, that the archive is a place of erasure. Now, having established that, what next? Sizothini, angithi? It's one thing ukuthi, hayi angi-includwanga, hayi I'm marginal, mara isho ukuthini lonto leyo? What do you do, right? Now, in the context of conducting research in academic spaces, I must also go back to the whole kind of interface between formal academic training and community engagement. I think Tina expression elininzi because we are confined by bases zama academic, ne? Mangaba says university, we don't see the linkages between what we do and the communities we come from. Isn't that so? So it is that traversing that difficult terrain of saying, if I am doing research, the research that I do, what impact does it have? Does it impact society? Are we together, good people? So for me, it was more about in detecting an erasure of Charlotte Maxeke. It was not just Maxeke. It had me thinking about a whole generation of her time. Ukuthi singabantu, we are not there. When we want to reclaim, sifuna Ukuzilanda, as the forge alludes, right? Uma sifuna Ukuzilanda, singabantu, where do we go? Right? Of course, the official archive of the state is limited in terms of what it can afford us. Now, it brings me to the present. Now, the archive is not the thing of the past, it is now. There's always a perception of archive, we're talking about the things of the past that are preserved for future references. So archive, we're going to get evidence of the past. Archivists, when they think they preserve records for future references. But in that fluctuation between the past and the future, there is the now. Isn't that so? Manje, kwenzekani, how do we begin to take stock of the life lived now? What other forms of archival inscription that begin to insert voices that could have been marginalized, voices that could have been silenced? Isn't that so? So mangaba sithetha ngama records, ama archive, asikhulumi ngo there and the future. There is the now in the operations of the archive. Isn't that so? So uma ngaba ndifika kuleyo ndawo ke, when I arrive at that point of realizing that archives are not so much about the future, are not so much about the past. There is this moment in the making of the archive now. How do we begin to rethink the now in the archive space, right? And then it took me back to a trajectory of AMA debates that were happening in South Africa, Masijonga, just on the verge of a democratic dispensation, right? People who have been writing in that space, like Abo Van Harris, who has he did some work on the destruction of public records in South Africa. Ukuti, on the verge of a democratic dispensation in 1994, the apartheid state went on a cleaning of AMA records, especially those that had to do with the operations of state military, state security forces. That form of erasure that is in the archive, right? Ukuti, most of the documents were destroyed on the verge of a democratic dispensation. Angiti? So that is the 90s debates. Now, masiya ku post-democracy, ku post-apartheid state, kwenzakalani ku archive, what is the tone? Zithini conversations, what are the conversations that begin to bring about an understanding of the archive, equi-democratic state? We want to think of it as an inclusive archive, isn't that so? Umangaba, what animates the archive, the apartheid, is erasure. What animated the archive of democracy? Isn't that so? We like to think of it as that which includes, right? Now let's go there. Now, with the passing of the Archives Act of 1996, let's look at what is happening in South Africa, Lapayan. The passing of the act on the side of the TRC is the now moment of the archive. That is the building of the archive of the state's account of itself based on TRC records. Ukuti now is the state that begins to form on the idea of a truth, of a reconciliation, of transparency. This is the state that we want to think of, right? That is the state that accounts of itself on the basis of a truth, a transparency, a reconciliation. That is the now, the moment of the archive in 1995-96. Alongside that is the now moment of the archival inscription that is informed by the land question. Isn't that so? The Land Commission, which I fortunately had a bit of experience in interacting with that archive of the land. Now, you begin to see now an archival inscription that begins to form around the land question in South Africa, which was through Amaline claims. People that were forcefully removed under apartheid laws were invited to make submissions and claim for the land they lost. Isn't that so? Now, we want to think of the archive as having evolved and as having gone beyond an erasure. Guess what? When we look into the TRC records, right? Now, if we thinking alongside Uven Harris, who has shown us that just on the verge of democracy, some of the records as classified were destroyed. Now, if there were gross human rights violations that were erased from the records, do you think those who suffered would be able to validate those claims? No. Certainly not. Because Umangaba City, just before we elected a new democratic state, archive that had to do with violations abantu. It means those who would want to validate what were violated, they won't have a record to back up because those records would have been destroyed. Coming to the land, working as a research assistant in the claims department in one of the urban cities where abantu were removed from the inner city in District 6. There, again, the archive resurfaces as a point where people can go and validate their claims, right? Now, what one discovers there is that some of the people who were not necessarily owners of the land in the inner city, but who were renting, who lost tenancy through that forced removal, could not launch their claim because the stakes of the debates were already set. It is those who owned the properties who could go and claim, but those who lost occupancy were left in the cold because they could not validate their claims on records. So we begin to see another form of erasure creeping in, even with that archive of land claims. So there's a continuation and an erasure that is built in the working of the archive. And people are probably asking, so what? Now, if an archive is a place of erasure, so what? Now, in preparing for this talk, I am about to stop now and allow other people to talk. I don't like to talk alone. And in the course of preparing for this talk, because as academics most finally society, I don't like citations kakhulu. Mandizothetha and Tandu uyenza a too scholarly approach in interact. Now, in preparing for this talk, I came across a very interesting book by a guy called Arthur Bradley. The title of the book is Unbearable Life, ne? A genealogy of political erasure. And that book, when I read that book, this guy talks about the question of political erasure. We trace in medieval Europe, from the time Roma, ne? What used to happen there, notable people, abantu of high stature in society, if you are found to have been at odds with the state, ne? You commit a crime, a treason of some sort. I-charge yako, your sentence, you were sentenced to what they called a permanent erasure. It means if you had property yako was going to be confiscated. If you had the luxury of having immemorials, memorials in your honor, all the things that kind of memorialize you in a society, you will be literally expunged, erased from the face, your city, right? So that is how a political erasure operated in medieval times. But he goes on to say, those practices of the state, right? Those practices of the state that we begin to see in the 21st century, that states in Europe are increasingly applying those methods of erasure. Now, people are erased under a whole categories. That you've got the immigrants, you had those who are enemies of the state, you have all different ethnic groups. So the state still has a way of ensuring some kind of an erasure that is accounted for on the basis of what would one talk about as state sovereignty, that the state has got the right to decide on who lives and who doesn't. But I like Bradley's conclusion. He works with two concepts there. Ukuthi, let's redefine life. What does it mean? For a person who has been stripped of all those honors, who has been rendered reduced to something, to nothing, that person is caught between two things. They live, but they don't die. It is in that continuum of a life that is lived, but is not lived in full, right? But yet it is not death. So it is in that continuum that Bradley talks about the radical potential of redefining life and what it means. Now, going back to the question of the archive, if the archive yamakoloniali, the archive apartheid was animated by erasure, and the assumption is that the archive of the democratic state should be that of including, and yet we're beginning to see that the inclusion is not there. What would it mean to begin to redefine life in a manner that is livable? And I think that is where the archival debate enables us to open up a space within the archive to begin to talk about life and living. If the archive of the colonial state was animated by death, by erasure, we should be in a space where we are able to open up, demand spaces of engagement that begin to assert the right to life. And in those few words, I'd like to add and invite people to, let's talk about this. I'm not the expert here. I just felt I needed to share.
Dr. April, thank you very much for a really enriching talk. I have a few questions and maybe some provocations. So I really appreciate that you mentioned how the state archives were very thin in terms of documentation on Mam Charlotte Maxeke. And I think there's something to be said about the state's mechanisms of recording people and how that can be attached to, I suppose, colonial notions of personhood, right? So if you're not recorded or you're not found in the state archives, then you're not a person. But in the same breath, the way that you are recorded, so that kind of ID photograph and certain kinds of descriptions that are attached to your documentation are what makes up the person. So I wonder if you could speak perhaps about the silence imminent in that kind of recording of a person, right? Because there's a lot that's left behind when you just record you as Dr. Thozama April, black woman, height, place of birth, and limit that description to your personhood. I think that there's a silence there and a form of erasure in that archive itself. And so my question becomes, is anything really lost by Umam Charlotte Maxeke not being particularly recorded in that way, right? Is anything really lost if she lives on in the oral traditions of her communities and those being the archive in a way? And then a final one, because I don't want to go on too long, I want to give you a chance to respond. You spoke about the interface between formal academic training and the community and community engagement. And I think that that's something that a lot of academics fail to do, even though we make claims to kind of be telling histories from the bottom or reconfiguring colonial narratives of African people and so on and so forth. There's still quite a limited and elitist audience that our work is available to. So my question then becomes, what do you think the potential of oral tradition is in filling the archival silences and erasures that we're experiencing, right? But also, if we do take into account the potential of these oral traditions, be it song, be it praise songs or stories that grandmothers and grandfathers carry on in for generations, what are the dangers of potentially institutionalizing these oral traditions and making them part of the very institution of the state archive or the museum or the university that we're problematizing? I think that's a conundrum that a lot of scholars, including myself, are facing in their work. Is you want to create visibility and access, and you want to kind of have these oral traditions be recognized as a kind of archive, but there's also a danger in kind of inserting them into these colonial establishments or institutions. Yeah, thanks.
On the first one, the recording itself. Now, I fully agree with you that it's problematic itself. I mean, when you think about how those mark shots, I mean, you go through the archives, those were done by ethnographers that took pictures and did those tests and measured, body and everything. That's problematic, of course. But I think your question about whether there is a potential, something kind of generative about a life that is lived outside of that archive. I always go back to Uma Charlotte Maxeke. The productive archive ka Charlotte is not inscribed in the colonial archive, in the archive of the state. Now, I think when we talk about archives, we limit ourselves to the archive, the formal archive, as it were. But there are other forms of archiving, of course. But I don't think they necessarily have to be formalized. For me, it is more about acknowledging, valuing. For example, when you're going back, what assisted me with the story Ska Charlotte was finding out Ukuthi, as early as 1903, African writers were already talking about that biographical inscription which comes with the naming of a child. Ukuthi, even though a child would not have a record, Abantu had a way of recording that moment when the child is born. When a child is born through the time of affliction, say there is disaster, right? In a time of calamity, kuthiwe umntwana kumashwa, to mark that moment, right? So there's a recording that is not in the form of a formal record, but within the context of Abantu and their way of being, their way of inserting themselves, they are able to say the child's naming, the naming of the child marks two things: the moment of birth, but also people are able to establish kuthiwe wazalwa ngoRene Petsu ngexesha leRindepest in the 20s, right? So there's always been throughout people's lives, people's existence, that form of acknowledging events, life-changing events, That's why, for me, the debate about the archive has to come to questions of life and living. Because much of our archival inscriptions have always been archives of death. Right? Now, if you talk about, other people will talk about the social death. I mean, when you talk about life, what is the kind of life that you are alluding to, right? That on its own is a form of archival as a kind of inscription. Ukuthi abantu claim to assert the right to life, the right to live, even in conditions that are trying to say, but we are here. For me, that's the most important thing to say. The archive is not limited to the past. It is not limited to a future reference. It is now. It is how people are beginning to kind of assert themselves to say, we are here, we are living. But what is the kind of life that we live? It is in that struggle of constantly redefining, the terrains of life and living in general. So for me, it's not always returning to the colonial archive with the intention of decolonizing the archive, so to speak, but it is being attuned and also alive to other possibilities, other forms of archival inscription that take place in all spaces that may and may not be under the gaze of the state.
Okay. Mina ngizobuza
Yebo sis.
ngesizulu. Indaba yokuqala I'm Melita Ngobo from Abahlali baseMjondolo. I'm from Tembisa, informal settlement. And most of where we are from, they don't know much about archives. Ngicabanga ukuthi mawungathi bacacisela kancane ukuthi mawukhulunywa ngearchives kusho into enjani. Ngicabanga ukuthi umlando womuntu, but most of us understand. And then my question is, since we are living in an informal settlement, let's say for an example, when I die, or are they going to tell the real story? Because in informal settlement, they are moving. Like where we are staying now, they are saying it is temporary. It means somewhere, someday we are going to move from the informal settlement that we are and going to Bashley Extension, where they are going to build RDPs. And then it means my history from the informal settlement will be erased. Most of what happened in that informal settlement, if there is no book that has been written, I think it's going to be erased. And then the other thing is about the government. Like when you say most of the things that happened during apartheid are being erased, but they allowed us to tell our story, to pour out our pain, to say we have lost our uncles, we have lost whatever we have lost, but not telling the truth that how did they die in the prison, because there were no evidence. And then it's still happening now. The government it is now. It is still happening because they are still erasing those many stories. Like last time we were shot, but when you go to the government asking why we were shot, because we knew that those guns were bought by somebody who's working from the municipality. When you ask that, they don't answer. Somebody will come to take some records, then after that they are gone, they don't come back with answers. It shows that something that was happening long time ago during apartheid, it's happening now. It means the freedom that we were fighting for them to be them. They wanted to be like those who were in apartheid, but they are black, but we're still living in an apartheid era.
Ndiyabonga siswam ngombuzo. Yeah, the first question was if I could just talk a bit about the archive. Ama-archive kulapho kugcinwa khona yonke information umbuso lo wesikhathi othi ugcine yonke information enento kwenza nabantu. ukuthi one of the things eyenzakalayo nge-advent of inansika i-modern state, i-state nje zonke nje in general ne, sithola ukuthi i-state si-invested ekwazeni abantu individual, umuntu ngamunye i-state opens up a file, uhamba uyofuna i-ID, la ID yakho i-reference estate enaso ngawe ukuthi ubani uhlala kuphi. So that's the first very generative act ye-state ekhona ukucollate information ngomuntu from birth up until time okhona ukuyahamba uyothatha ipasi lakho. So i-state sine database, sine archive kulapho kugcinwa khona information yabantu nje in general. So sine control over who is where, who's doing what, where, nini. Angithi. So that is one element. Ukuthi masitha ngama archive sithetha kulapho kugcinwa khona i-information. But usually ke ama archive estate are always ama archive that have to do with sona estate. Ukuthi siyachaza ukuthi mangaba sine records zabantu sizazigcina for i-purpose sokhona ukuthi sazi ukuthi ubani ukuphi. That is the records nje in general. But kuphinde kube khona the other aspect here archive that has to do with ukuthi of what interest has the state on this individual, umzekelo. Ukuthi you could have a registry of thina sisonke sila ne uma ngaba you get arrested, you are singled out, uthatha ama fingerprints uyofaka ku database ukuthi you offender. Angithi. So there are these different categories that is what Bradley is talking about. Ukuthi in the 21st century, state is nama category ahlukene. There is no kind of broader kind of blanket approach ukuthi ubani, but there are these different categories zabantu state ene information yaso. So masitha ngama archives sitha ngento enjalo nje in general ukuthi kulapho kugcinwa khona i-state sigcina zonke i-records of interest kuso ngabantu when it comes to abantu. But you have got government departments as a depositor, everything as the administration, they keep those records. So they are the kind of property of the state. Kulapho kugcinwa khona. The question about the fact that even today, umangaba sithetha nge erasure ye archive, we're talking about the erasure of the archive under apartheid, but it still continues today. And I think that is what we're trying to allude to, Masikuluma City. Unless we are able to see in this erasure the potential yokuthi. Let's take the example. One of izinto as agitator debates around archive and archiving ngoku, ne? The question of public access to information. Angithi ukuthi abantu banelungelo public education evulekayo lapha yana ukuthi sazi ukuthi awaphi amalungelo esinawo thina singabantu from the state. Ukuthi sidemanda ntoni kwi-state uma ngaba i-state sicollata i-information yethu through ama cell phone, sicollata i-state i-information through every element uvule account lapha nalapha, that database. Angithi now i-Public Access to Information Act, it regulates ukuthi abantu must have access to records ezikwi-domain ye-public for their own. Angithi. So umangaba tina asikhona uku-engage i-state as to what do you do with the information you collect ngathi. Angithi. So there's a space to hold those who are in position of the authority to account on the basis of us being able to know ukuthi uma sisange information ayonto nje bantu bakithi. Information these days, states are run on information. Mangaba, we are free tina ukunikisa nge information without asking for what purpose is this. Angithi. So it is for us the opportunity as citizens to hold those who are in position of authority to account. Sazi ukuthi public access to information gives me the right to go to ama record Pretoria ndifune ukwazi information ngaloku naloku. The informal settlements, right? informal settlements are temporary, unyanisile ukuthi, and what kind of archival inscriptions do abantu abakuma informal settlement have? And it so as they get recording, records informal settlement awakho permanent. Jengbusicho, my sister, ukuthi the next thing you'll be told ukuthi you are being removed from, but that archival trace of having lived. For me, that is why the question of the archive is more about life and lived experience, the lived reality. That inscription, ukuthi sihlala la, Thembisa ndazumthambeka section. Seduzane, uyabona. So sihlale la for this number of years, and our relationship with this space, yile. You are able to inscribe your presence in terms of ukuthi. Even if it's a community project that begins to draw on experiences zabantu ibe laphaya in the informal settlement, for people to be able to claim the space and claim their reality, the lived reality of the space. So for me, I think the question of archive, state kuphela, there is scope within that statist discourse to begin to intercept it in a manner that brings new energy, ukuthi which aspects of our lived reality are suppressed by not engaging the archive. Angithi? Uma ngaba asidilishani with the because the archive must be born as an apparatus of state control. You are on the receiving end, but awunandlela ukuthi but my lived reality yalento ithini. Angithi? So uma ngaba i-community has got its memory projects zasekuhlaleni ukuthi we are able to draw on our lived experience. We are able to draw on our reality as a community, as a collective, to say sihlala la, sihlala kanje, this is our reality. We have an information center that begins to draw on our tina la for tina, for our own sanity, for our children, you know, for future generations, for the now, to begin to say, sihlala la, kanje, na kanje, na kanje. So for me, the question of archive is not lost in terms of it being thrown to the past or in the future. That is yet to come, but it is the now question of how people make sense of themselves and make sense of their lives. And it goes back to the question you were making, my sister, regarding the incorporation of these alternative ways of being into the mainstream, which I don't think it's necessarily about that, but it is diluting that space so that that space does not have the luxury of an erasure that is not disturbed. It will continue to erase, but there must always be that noise and necessary to say things cannot carry on the way they are. So when saying an archive, it is a space so good when we collate our lived experience to say we can preserve ubutina, they remain within the space. For they will never be a part of a deeds office because you cannot claim that land. You are always threatened with the eviction. So you are not in that terrain. Ne? So, but still within that, there's a potential to begin to forge some kind of recognition by virtue of saying, Sila, Sihalala, this is our lived reality. We are able to inscribe ourselves into the space by having these collective memory projects, collective memory hubs residing within the community itself.
Goodness, I feel like, should I now still ask my questions? That was, it was yes, such please. A good intervention. I have one comment and then two questions. I know you said that you didn't want to go into decolonization today, but so I'll put it as a comment, so you don't have to respond if you don't want to. I think the issue of the archives is central to decolonization. So, Ndlovu Gachini wrote about decoloniality and its three elements, being, knowledge, and power. So you spoke very eloquently about the archives and how it relates to our ontology and who we are. But I really like what you said in the beginning about how it relates to knowledge and how we go to the archives seeking truth claims about the past and hoping to find evidence to validate what we know. And I feel like that's the crux of the matter. Like, perhaps we need to rethink our knowledge systems and how we validate knowledge, because if that were true, then we wouldn't be having all these problems where certain official records have been destroyed, right? So archives and rethinking the archives and knowledge systems is central to decolonization. And also because knowledge is central to legal entitlements, like you were talking about, the land claims or any other form of reparations, but also political entitlements, because now the fact that I exist in a record system allows me to enforce my citizenship in a variety of ways, right? So that's just the one comment I wanted to make. The question I have is, I skimmed very quickly through the Archives Act that you were talking about, and it seems to talk more about how records should be preserved and to whom authority should be delegated, rather than describing how the decisions are made about what goes into the archive. So it seems like you were talking about contestations, like maybe one should start there and actually change the law with regards to, unless there is in another act where it talks about that sort of thing, but we need to talk about what is the criteria for things being archived in the first place, right? That's the first question. And then the second question is, I wanted to ask what your opinion is on private archives. I'm thinking of two examples. Being someone who is from the Western Cape and has ancestors, lots of ancestors from the West Coast, there are several sites of rock art that are on private reserves. Now, I just feel that's completely wrong, because something that is of such national significance should not be under private ownership, right? The second example I was thinking of, there's at the Jarvis Centre, which is it's the art centre associated with the University of Pretoria. They have this massive exhibit that is talking about how artists have contributed to the struggle against apartheid. So it's very vast, different kinds of media of art, literary, visual art, music, everything. And I was speaking to the curator, who's also a friend of mine. She was talking about how difficult it was to get access to certain artworks who were done by black artists, who were central to, our art history, but were sitting in the hands of private collectors. Some of them were even overseas, and who had all kinds of terms and conditions about how and when these artworks could form part of this exhibit. And so it brings in again this whole idea of private ownership constraining public interest and access. So if you could just maybe speak to those two things. Number one, the Archives Act and criteria for archiving things, and then number two, what your opinion is of private archives.
Yes. To the first question, what I was trying to get at is to say, thinking alongside people like Achille Mbembe, because by the time we get to the debates on archives in the 2000s, it was a review precisely of that act. They were engaging with the limits of the act, that it did not allow for an intense engagement with the processing itself. So I think there, it's not getting stuck into interpretation of the act, for that has already been done, that people have already critiqued the limits of the act. Hence the title of that paper by Mbembe is The Power and the Limits of the Archive, for they were already engaging with that earlier work on the formation of the Archives Act. So the limits of the Act have already been alluded to. But where I think the conversation is right now, it is in interrogating, you know, when you talk about the archive, the status of the archive, already it gives you these two extremes. It is the past recordings of what has been done, right? It is the preservation of that which has been done in the past for future. For me, the archive is now, that's what I'm arguing. It is about being actively engaged in the act and the consciousness around the limits of what the state does, but at the same time being able to say, we are not catered for in this archiving that is generated through the processing of the information. What areas of engagement can we begin to think of, even within the idea of public access to information? Now, who is the public? When you talk about, for example, the collection of artworks by individual artists, already the terrain is privatized. The question would be, has the family of the artist come forth? Already that discussion is privatized. It falls in the private domain. Now, when you talk about life lived, for me, it's a redefinition of the public and public interest itself, which is not a readily available concept. It is subject to contestation. So for me, it is all these kind of pockets of areas of active engagement, active citizenship that begins to form around the archive. The archive is not dead, is not past, it is not in the future, it is in the now. So it is when we get to that space of saying, for example, going back to you, my sister, ukuthi as a community la, asaziwa nje nokuthi sikhona. Asaziwa ngomuso sila nemikhukhu yethu, tomorrow azofika ama-red end ayasiremova. What would you have recourse to say, of course we've been here long enough, but the inscription, the archival trace, the inscription of those who occupy a space at a given time is as important as the kind of life that people live in that space. So for me, it is imagining the unimaginable within the archival space. It is those things that we don't see that we want to engage with for us to make sense of the present. There's no way that if the limits of the Archives Act is such that it does not openly, avail certain rights, like an engagement with public access to know ukuthi ndinayo i-right to go to the ministry, to go to kwa Home Affairs and verify citizenship yam. But still, coming back to what you are saying, that there are certain kinds of entitlements attached to citizenship. Now, how do we redefine, get into that conversation? For me, the archive, it's always filled with those potential to begin to open up spaces for contestation, spaces for engagement. It is not a done deal. That was in the past, it is in the now. It opens up spaces for engagement. It opens up spaces for contestation. And so far, I think for me, what really troubles me in the idea of the archive, as we alluded to last year, it is this question of erasure that is built in the assumptions that are embedded with archive. Right? It erases, it announces a presence, but at the same time erases. It is constantly in that continuum of acknowledging and erasing, You are being audited, but at the same time, akukho security of itenya ne rights zalamhlaba nihlala kuwo. It acknowledges, but at the same time erases. Acknowledges, erases. It is in that continuum that I think a kind of robust engagement with the notion of the archive is productive in the sense that it's not readily available. It is a space that we can all cohere around and begin to form some kind of dialogues and conversations. It's an ongoing thing. I don't think, we always think of an archive as that which exists, it's there, it's done, but for me, what I've observed, it is constantly in that continuum of acknowledging and erasing, and erasure. That is on the formal side of the state. But there are other forms of archival inscriptions that are not necessarily residing with the processes of the state. That the potential for a community that is under siege, that is threatened with eviction, that are able to begin to collate their memories and begin to have some kind of semblance of an existence, so to speak, to claim some kind of existence within that limited space. Of course, no one wants to be limited, but we are limited, we are constrained, but within that space of confinement, within that constraint, we can still make those claims to the state. There's a hand there, a mover lapaya.
Evening, everyone. So I'm going to stand because I can't see you from here. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's funny how the archive is an inanimate site, but it evokes such, conflicting emotions with what it contains, or rather what it doesn't contain. So I'm thinking about the archive, and I think about that the dilemma of erasure itself is layered, because with black bodies being erased from the archive, there are other bodies that are erased, even in today. These are women, queer bodies. So there's already another set of, issues that, encapsulate this concept of erasure. And then I'm also thinking about this idea of identifying, or rather rethinking, the archive as a site of contestation. Because if we are arguing that there are erasures that take place or have taken place within the archive, then it can't be an immutable space. Then it can't be a place that is enshrined. And yet somehow as scholars, when we go into the archive, we consider that as absolute truth. And that is what we have to cite. Because if you don't cite it, then it's plagiarism. And yet somehow you're citing something that could be contested. Well, that's another topic for another time. But I'm really thinking about this idea of also avoiding creating binary others. So when we try to have alternatives for the archive, we create an other. It has to be so definitive. But if we understand that if the archive is a fluid space, then there's going to be varied, interpretations and approaches to it. Thank you.
Yes, Ngozi Gqirha. I just want to make a comment onto this issue of access to information. Then the access of information around Joburg, it used to be at the Cornhill. Now it has moved to VETS, which is SAHA, South Africa History Archives. So how is it important to us as citizens? Because all of us here, we are needed to participate with IDP, Integrated Development Plan, and we are voters, which is, we are also having a right to access to sanitation and other resources estates. But it doesn't happen in that way. So we used to have these engagements, these workshops of paia, how to make a paia. Paia is easily made by people who are lawyers. Then it's so quicker. But I think we need to have a workshop on to how to make all of these things. And then including the housing, the ownership of the pieces of the lands that we were occupying, because some of the lands are abandoned lands, were owned by the colonialists. But the state knows nothing about that, because they don't even do the audits, the public audits of the land, including the buildings that we're occupying here. Some of them are under grab. The state does not know. Even the properties which are abroad, embassies, they don't know, if you can ask them. They don't. So it's very important to know who even the land that now the people of Tembisa are occupying, where does that land belongs to? Local government, or provincial government, or national government? They can't answer that. But it's so easy when you go to archives and then to determine who owns this land. And then who wins these tenders of feeding our kids. We have a right to know that, Then to interdict the government, stop, because we are not there. But whereas we are counted when we are doing the social audits. So it doesn't have to happen in that way. So I was just trying to make input onto that. So, my question is, as I grew up in the former Transkei, so we read that there are so many adventures that took place there. Remember the song that we were singing, Tsikane, when he was prophesying about the colonialists who would come and then possess our land, bringing the book and the coin with no holes, which is, Tsikane was a son of Gaba. And also the wars that were fought by the Xhosas against the colonialists, which took 100 years. But those wars are not recorded. Onxele, Nondota, they are not found anywhere. So those people, they played a very, very inspirational and profound roles, including in influencing the so-called Mandela's Sobukwe's of the modern times. So now, even there's this guy, that song, famous song, Liza Lisitinga Lako Tikonko Senyanis, Teosoka, Uchuacha, even the Christians, if you ask, do you have an idea of who's that man who wrote that song? Who was trained there by the British, Scottish, was by missionaries. So now the question is, can we trust something now to convert that into liquidity for a social beneficiation in terms of instilling up the monuments, so tourism, attracting the people, and then to say, okay, this is what has happened, Now can we reap something and then we make it more resourceful for the beneficiation of the people? We're in a state of stagnancy in the economy. But how can we tap from those histories now? Thank you.
Hi, comrades.
Hi.
Comrades, the question of the archive is a haunting question. The archive is a repository of traumatic experiences over the history of a black person. The archive is not easily approachable. The archive itself is menacing. Having said that, comrades, for those who dare to study the archive, there is this ghost in the house that we refuse to speak of. How the archive has since become a very contested space, particularly in the advent of the African nationalist movements taking power in Africa. The archive has been revised. The archive is subject to factional fights. The archive is now tradable on the stock exchange. I mean, it depends who is releasing what memoir. The archive has reduced African scholarship to a geography, if I might say so. Look at the case of Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe had to resort to erasing himself so as to assert himself. That is, in other words, not have a mausoleum. Go be hidden somewhere in your village and be buried 6 feet with concrete and solid steel on top. No one should dig up your bones. God damn those anthropologists. Erasure now is a form of assertion in generating multiple and divergent archives. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you for all those questions and comments. I'll take the first one, my sister there. Thank you. I think the point you are making were more of a comment, and the caution there, I fully agree with you that we shouldn't be looking at binaries, right? We shouldn't looking at creating binaries in critiquing the official state and thinking of an alternative as in binaries. But what I think I'm trying to get at there is that the mode of archiving that is in official archives is restrictive in the sense that, you know, it won't allow for certain kinds of claims. It's a contested space, of course, but I think it's better expressed when we see this alternative spaces where the things that animate archiving in a different form without creating that binary. I fully concur with you. A classical example for me at the university where I work is the question of the liberation archives. Because my critique, even when you go to my thesis, is that the mode of archiving itself is still informed by those colonial practices, right? So I fully concur with you that in critiquing, we don't want to create binaries, but the work of an alternative space helps to make claims that you are not able to make within the official, because there's something in that is corrupted, that is prefigured, that won't allow for any kind of engagement beyond what it presents. Now, going to the comment by my brother there as to history yonsikana, yomakanda kanxele, you name them. Now, when we talk about archive, there's always, Carolyn Hamilton has got this very interesting thing about it. She talks about the tone and the grammar and the register of the archive. It is that which sets the tone for the archival debate at a given time. Now, if we go back to what I've just highlighted here with the making of the post-apartheid dispensation, the tone and the register your archive there, what sets the tone for your archiving is the TRC, is the land, right? So for me, it's always kind of interesting to see how an archival moment is animated by a certain processes which are not internal to the archive, right? So, Brother Wam, you're talking there about beneficiation through an active engagement with the history of the fallen heroes, those who resisted colonial intrusion. It's a debate on its own, because when we go to colonial archive, what animates colonial archive, it is not the lives of inkosi zethu, right? It is not a life. For me, that is why, for me, when we change the terms of engagement, when we begin to change the terms of engagement, that what sets the tone, what animates debates, is it death, is it life? It is in that continuum, that of asserting the right to live and being at ease and being able to claim a life in a space that denies you an existence. It is not a prefigured terrain, it is a terrain that people make, right? Like Onxele were not given a space, but they contested the space. So that archive does not come as a result of some kind of entitlement, but it is through contesting. It is through contestation to say, I am going to resist colonial intrusion of my land. And then the archive won't recognize that because it is an archive of intrusion under colonial times. It doesn't animate with Unxele resisting. It would be a question of administration. Even when you go to the archive, you don't get an archive of uMakhanda kaNxele resisting. No, you get some kind of references here and there when a certain colonial official reports on events and happenings in that part of the world that you come across that figure. So the archive does not begin with acknowledging those figures, but those figures made their history, but they made it in such a way that did not warrant an archival inscription. But they just happened to be in the archive because for a certain Hare, who was a colonial soldier, was reporting on occurrences there. So what animates that archive is not Unqaile's activities, but Hare's own account of what had happened there. Can we see that? So that erasure is there. The person is in the archive, but it's not an archive of his own making. Now, the question would be, when will we ever get the archive of the people's own making? That is where, for me, the question of life and living regardless, that animates a new kind of archival inscription that is not inscribed by death, but that which contests the right to live and how that life should be. For me, it is in that continuum.
So where are these heritage, South African Heritage Council? It's because in terms of acknowledging.
Well.
Where are they?
My brother here, the erasure. Oh, we are baleka ngoku. Where is she response yako? You thought I'm not going to respond? You're gonna hear, okay, thank you. So I like your how he subverts the question, like the question of the archive, the erasure itself. I think if I got him right, he said there's something productive, there's something radical about erasure. That within that context of not being counted in, outside of that inscription, there's so many potential kind of formation that begin to form outside that. If you are not kind of captured in the recording, there's something else that is at play there. I think there's point there about other forms of archival inscriptions that form outside of the formal, which for me still is not a binary, but acknowledging those sides where people make claims to life, which are always in that continuum between what is official and what is regarded as unofficial. Because archival inscriptions occur in that space. For instance, when people protest and are removed, even those people who would have lived in an informal settlement unaccounted for, when they get arrested, they are inscribed in the registry. Isn't that so? It's an archival inscription of a different kind now, as opposed to being audited and being recorded. So for me, it's always that fluid space, of course, but also for me, it's always about a life lived. For me, I think if I'm able to make this point, I'll be happy. I'll sleep, you know. If I'm able to make this point about the archive and the potential, it's not doing it. I'm not saying it is doing it, right? But it has got a potential within that space of an erasure. We are able to make a claim about a life lived, even if it is a life that is not accounted for. Like in my case, when I studied Makleke, I could prove that she lived, even regardless of the fact that she was not recorded. Am I making myself clear here? So if I'm able to prove that Mama Makleke lived in 1871, long before the Population Registration Act came into being in South Africa. Now, thinking with that in mind, that people live lives even if they are not within that population registration, but we claim that existence. Siyazilanda, as Ifoj encourages us to do, to reclaim the trajectories, all those histories that were rendered unthinkable. I like to think of that. When we think of lives that were rendered unthinkable within the space of the colonial space, sama colonial, ukuthi abantu lived even if they were not recognized as living human beings, but they lived. Now it is that space of contestation of a life, of claiming, of asserting the right to live within a society, a community, and asserting that. It's a continuous process. I don't think it's something that the archive on its own is able to entirely hold together. It tries to hold it, but it somehow evades the archive and allows for other forms of engagement.
A round of applause for Dr. Thozama April.